everyone. I am Dr. Kisa Boykin from the OT department, and the IDEA Committee is hosting this next set of expert exchange talks. And the first one is cultural competence in healthcare. But before I introduce our first speaker, I'd like to tell you about the IDEA Committee. And forgive me for reading. It's fairly long and I don't want to mess it up. So just so you know, the charge of the IDEA Committee, it was to facilitate policies, guidelines, and programs that support the university's commitment to inclusion, growth, and a sense of belonging for all our students, faculty, and staff. The committee encourages respect for diversity of backgrounds, ideas, and perspectives, and deals honestly and constructively with issues of equity and inclusion. The committee also supports students through diverse clinical learning experiences, curriculum, and career opportunities, focused on cross-cultural sensitivity and preparing graduates for the global workforce and society. So that's the charge for the IDEA Committee. For those of you that were curious, what is the IDEA Committee? That is our charge. The IDEA Committee, I guess I should have told you what IDEA stands for. It stands for Inclusion, Diversity, Equality, and Access Committee. Now, our first speaker for tonight will be Erica Kiernan, and I'll give you a little bit of her bio. She received her bachelor's degree in science at Old Dominion University. After graduating, she served 2.5 years in the Peace Corps living in West Africa. She is a graduate from the University of St. Augustine's Doctor of PT program and Master of OT program. She completed her PhD in public health at the University of Florida. Presently, she is full-time faculty at the University of St. Augustine, where she instructs the physical therapy and occupational therapy curriculum since 2008. So welcome, Dr. Erica Kiernan.
Thank you, Dr. Boykin. And I'm so excited. I actually see some of my students, so welcome. But I was asked to speak on cultural competence. This is a subject that's very near and dear to my heart. And I have in the past also taught an elective course on cultural competence. So as I move through, it's shaped very similar to what I touched on in my courses as well. And it's really shaped around the healthcare profession. So the objectives of what we are trying to go through tonight is we're going to talk about what cultural competence is when we say those words, the continuum that it's on. There are some self-assessments we're going to touch on, the definition of implicit bias, and also how you can self-assess implicit bias. And then we're going to identify some issues related to racial and ethnic disparities in health, variables related to health disparities, and also some resources available to you. So in a way, this is going to give a broad overview for what future presentations are going to go in more depth. So cultural competence. This definition has been around since 1989 from Cross, and it's really a seminal kind of definition. And it's long, not going to lie, it's long. But I think the important thing when we talk about cultural competence, it's a set of behaviors, attitudes, and policies. And they come together in a continuum to enable the healthcare system or any agency that would like to explore cultural competence, even the individual practitioner, to function effectively in transcultural interactions. In practice, when we talk about cultural competence, we are acknowledging and incorporating at all levels the importance of individual culture, the assessment of cross-cultural relations, and the need, this is really important, the need to be aware of the dynamics resulting from cultural differences. the expansion of cultural knowledge, and the adaptation of services to meet culturally unique needs. So this is extremely important when we talk about being future healthcare professionals, or those of us who are healthcare professionals. Culture, when we define culture, characteristics and knowledge of a particular group of people. So in other words, culture are the customs, the arts, the social institutions, and achievements of a particular nation, people, or other social group. And based on this definition, culture is learned rather than biologically inherited. So this is a learned thing. We learn our culture through experience. And it actually has three dynamics of culture. We have non-material culture, material culture, and behavior. When we think of these three types of components that go into culture, when we think of material, that's our tangible part of our culture. So you could probably look around you, or you could even make judgments about me based on what's hanging on my wall behind me about something that I might be a culture or part of a culture. A little side note and caveat, this is why I actually have really enjoyed virtual meetings, because it brings people into my environment and I get to go into their home. And it kind of peels away a layer that has consequences, some good, some bad. But material culture is dress, jewelry, important heritage and artifacts. Non-material culture, this is where we might have intangibles like values, attitudes, feelings, beliefs. And then behavior. This is how a particular culture you identify with, their norms within that culture. So I can think of when I was placed in another culture and I had to learn what was appropriate within that culture. When I lived in West Africa, in Benin, the Republic of Benin, I had to change my dress to a certain extent. I came from a little beach town, Virginia Beach, in the USA. It's hot, we wore shorts. West Africa, it's equatorial Africa. It's hot, I'm gonna put on a pair of shorts. Oh no, you're not in Benin, because shorts are not appropriate to be worn, even by men. Shorts are reserved for working, if you are doing labor, or children. So I had to adjust to that. When I lived in the Philippines when I was younger, behavior, it was a society that very respectful of elders. So as children would greet elders, it was appropriate to raise the elder's hand to the forehead of the child. It's kind of a bow. It was very respectful. But that is a behavior, part of that culture. There is a continuum of cultural competence. It's actually as you work through these stages. And again, this comes from the seminal work of Cross. And it's really important to understand maybe where you, or even an organization you're part of, where they sit on this continuum. And I've kind of color-coded it. You'll see that red flag. Okay, red flag is cultural destructiveness. This is really where we don't want people to be, because it is part of dehumanization of another group. It is treating someone as not even on a level of being human. And in healthcare, we just deny services to somebody that we do not think of as not even being equal, but not even being part of the human race to serve. So cultural destructiveness. Stage 2, we're still in a questionable area, of course. It's called cultural incapacity. And in cultural incapacity, healthcare systems are unable to effectively work with other cultures. And that is really demonstrated by biases, something called paternalism. So treating others kind of as children, and I am the all-knowing source, and lots of stereotypes gets thrown around at this stage. Stage 3 is what is called cultural blindness. Now, cultural blindness, it just assumes all people are the same. There is no bias. It assumes there's no bias. Let's be clear about there. It's not that no bias exists. It's that there's an assumption that there's no bias. This is where sometimes very unhelpful phrases occur, like, oh, I don't see color. I treat and love everyone the same, because you are not recognizing the differences and you are not seeing people for the unique individuals that they are. So these policies and practices, they don't recognize the need for cultural specific approaches to problem solving. So services tend to be very ethnocentric. And ethnocentric is evaluating other people's cultures according to the standards of one's own culture. And so this is an area where assimilation is really pushed. Must assimilate to my culture or this culture. And in healthcare, if we're dealing with cultural blindness, a lot of times the patient is blamed for their problems because judgments have been made. And that is victim blaming. And that is exactly what we as professionals should not be doing to provide empathetic care. Now, these 3 stages is where I hope most people are probably at. And if you're attending these, I'm going to say you are somewhere in these 3 stages, okay? Because these are the 3 stages where growth is starting to occur. Stage 4, cultural pre-competence. This is committed. There's this commitment to using appropriate responses to culture. And now we're finally taking some time to reflect and acknowledging weaknesses. And we're also searching for alternatives. We're kind of starting on a journey. Stage 5, cultural competence, is where we have cultural differences are now accepted and respected. And there is an expansion of cultural knowledge and resources, and continuing adaptation of services occur. This is where we start to see continuing self-assessment about culture and the dynamics of cultural differences that exist. And the final stage is cultural proficiency, okay, stage 6. This is where it would be great of where we could see everybody be, is the cultural proficiency. But proficiency approaches to enhance culturally competent practice. This is where cultural differences are not just respected, not just accepted, they're highly regarded, because there's a recognition that cultural differences bring strength, especially if we're talking about healthcare and we're talking about organizations. And this is an area where now people are actively seeking to research and develop new approaches based on this highly regarding differences among people. As you move through this continuum, okay, this is not a one and done, right? It would be so nice, right? I move through all these stages. It's like a video game. I get to stage 6. Woohoo! I'm proficient. And I take myself a nice little test. Here I am, okay? But it isn't. It is a continual process of improvement and self-reflection, because we're always coming across different cultures. We're always going to be coming across people that are different than us. And something to keep in mind, every single interaction you have, regardless of if you think you're in a cultural group that's similar to you or looks like you or talks like you, that's still a cultural exchange. You're still talking to a very different individual with different experiences. So this is showing that as you move through the stages, you self-reflect to move forward. Okay, move forward. But then once you get into kind of a new stage, you have to self-reflect from where you were at. This serves a couple purposes, okay? First, self-reflection allows you to understand and learn and know yourself deeper. It also allows you not to make the mistakes that you have made in the past and to be mindful of that. But I'm going to encourage you to also think, it also is going to help you maybe relate to somebody who is not quite at the stage you are at, and cultivate empathy for somebody who might not be at a stage that is at a stage of understanding, or in an earlier stage where they're just trying to get knowledge, so that you have empathy because you've been there before. So self-reflection is a huge, huge part of really working towards cultural competence. So I'm going to take through 3 steps of what I consider the journey. Step 1, know thyself. Okay, Socrates said, to know thyself is the beginning of wisdom. And the only way you're going to really start to make change is if you know where you're at and what you need to change. There are a slew of assessments for cultural competence out there. A large majority are more in a checklist format, but this list here gives just a little snippet that in the research demonstrated moderate or better internal consistency and reliability. But it's just a short list of examples. And these scales can assess cultural competence of an individual. That's really what these are focused on. However, there are multiple tools available to assess the cultural competence also of an organization. So there's tools out there for you to do this self-reflection, this self-assessment. But there's also another tool that's really important, because these self-assessments really give you the time to think through, logically reason through, what do I believe? Well, what about what I don't even realize I believe? I know that sounds weird, but something called implicit bias. Implicit bias is also called unconscious bias. It's pretty popular now. You've probably heard the term, okay? And it's deeply rooted, okay, in these experiences, deeply ingrained among us, our experiences, our society, our environment, what we're exposed to all the time. And they are very, very unconscious, and they're usually just kind of activated involuntarily, without awareness or without control. And I really stress that just because you might have an unconscious bias, don't think that you might actually treat someone or another group consciously different. Okay, I think that's one thing to really stress about this. And there's this website from Ohio State that just an excellent resource. This is going to be shared, but I'm actually going to put it in your chat box. Just because you're on a computer, I thought, hey, why not? If you want to open it up and bookmark it, go right ahead. So let's talk a bit about how we assess this implicit bias. Project implicit. Has anybody ever taken an implicit bias test? There's about 50 people on this presentation. Okay. Dr. Well, I always call her Theus, Dr. P. So we have quite a few people that have taken implicit bias tests. It is excellent. First, I'm going to go ahead and copy in the link, okay? Because if you get bored of me droning on and on, I would suggest you take an implicit bias test, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. Okay. So the implicit project, okay, this was developed, it was founded actually in 1988 by 3 different scientists from 3 different universities. And this is housed on its own website, but the testing itself is actually housed through Harvard Education. It's a nonprofit organization. They are the most well known for the assessment test, the online assessment test you can take. But there's also consulting services listed on here, lectures, workshops, and you can access this site and choose from a number of different assessments. And these assessments range from race to assessing associations you might have of gender, fat versus thin, disability, transgender. And one important thing to keep in mind about it is this assessment, if you take any number of these tests, great many of them, it's about association, okay, association. It's not about right or wrong. There is a time component to it because it's assessing how quick you are to answer and associate certain words or images by clicking 2 keys. There's also a handheld app version as well. But there's solid science behind it of why this works. Because the test itself can be a little defensive. I see Dr. Boyd laughing and shaking her head because I'm going to caution you. When I would make students take this, okay, and I would make them take it cold, no explanation needed, just do this. And then we would discuss it. It brings up some defensiveness. You're like, I don't really think that. Oh, and Dr. Surratt just said, this is stressful. I don't think that. Now, going back to what implicit bias is, these are involuntary responses. These are shaped by sometimes just what's around us, what we're inundated with on a daily basis. So a lot of times you'll take one of these tests and you'll think, I can't think this. I'm one of these categories. This doesn't make sense to me. But it's getting at a neuroscience component. And I teach neuroscience, so I'm going to dork out a little bit on the neuroscience because that's who I am. But the thing is, with this fast timing and associating between words or images, and then they switch the keys on you, is that it might seem confusing and it might seem frustrating. Absolutely. Okay. But it is trying to remember, at implicit unconscious bias. So meaning that we have that automatic response, involuntary response. So it's trying to override your logical system because your emotions, those gut instincts, they reside in the same area of the brain, the limbic system, as your emotions and your memories. Okay, emotions and memories. There we go. Take kind of housed together. We're tapping into that. If the questioning was clear and you were given unlimited time to think about it, throughout this assessment, you know, it wouldn't be tapping into your unconscious bias, it would be tapping into your conscious bias. And it would be accessing a totally different part of your brain, your frontal lobe, your logical thinking. And that's not what we're trying to get at. So a lot of it is, I don't like this test, it's frustrating, I do not agree with these results. Not at all. It's confusing. It would have been different if I wasn't tired, if I had more time. Oh, this is ridiculous. But what I always remind people is, remember, this is not a reflection of your actual beliefs and how you would outwardly and explicitly treat people, all right? So question being, if it's unconscious and it doesn't truly reflect how I treat people, then why would I do it in the first place? Why is it important? Because it is important to start to understand why we might have or said or done something without thinking that it did appear, why it did appear insensitive, or why we naturally gravitate towards a particular group. You cannot fix or improve or work on what you are not aware of. So this is my self-reflection. I took 2 of these just yesterday, right? So first one I took was on comparing what they call fat and thin people. Okay, no need to mince any words, fat and thin people. And it had to do with looking at silhouettes of individuals, and then there were what were categorized as good and bad words. And this is what I got: an association, a strong association, automatic preference for thin people over fat people. I mean, that doesn't make me feel comfortable to say that by any means, not at all. However, this is where self-reflection starts coming in. Instead of getting defensive over your results, let's sit with it a while. Let's like ruminate on it a while. You know what? From watching my family and friends in the diet culture, all right, that's going to affect kind of how I view body type. There's a predominant society in which I, as well as a large majority of Americans, live in, where thin is the ideal. Look at social media, look at movies all the time. Our heroines are thin, and I grew up in the 90s where, let's face it, anybody remember heroin chic? Ugh, but you know, Kate Moss, oh, the little thinner the better, right? Fat associated with laziness. You see those images all the time. Slovenly, right? Thin is successful, fat is not. Body weight equals self-worth. And let's face it, the health profession of choice, as a physical therapist, we deal with physical movement, and sometimes that gets translated to body and weight. I also took another test where I had a slight automatic association. So again, this was not quite as strong, but I definitely am female with a career. Why do I still have this automatic response of males with a career and female with family? You know what? Well, that's my husband actually stayed home with my kids. All right, maybe that's why it's not quite as strong. All right, I'm the main financial support of my family, and my husband stayed home with my kids. But I also was raised in a household where my mom was the main caregiver. My mom did stay home with us in my younger years. It's the society expectations that mom raises kids, and I'm sorry if that was repeated, it should say, and dad works. Okay? That was around me growing up. So again, this is looking at associations. Are they strong? And they use wording like this: slight, strong. A good question. Somebody asked us a good question. So it could mean that you may truly feel what's in your subconscious, but may not externally act on it and verbalize it. Correct. That is a good way to think of it, Angela, is that these are things that we can't a lot of times get away from. We can't I mean, we could try living under a rock and never picking up our phone and looking at social media, but right? There's a lot we can't get away from, and it's ingrained deeply. So what's step 2? All right. So step 2, step 1 was knowing yourself. Where do I start? Step 2, knowing the world. Okay, we've admitted to ourselves that, hey, these are some areas where I'm noticing that maybe I need to address further. So now let's talk about the world in which I live in, and I need to educate myself on that world. So the first thing is we need to know that, and Dr. Boykin is even going into more detail regarding this, but we need to understand that there are multiple disparities within the US health system along racial and ethnic lines. And when we look at the makeup of the United States, predominantly we have about 75% of the population is Caucasian or identifies themselves as white. 13% of the population self-identifies as Black or African American. Then we have about 17%, give or take. This is why these numbers don't always add up, because people cross groups sometimes, white, Hispanic versus white, non-Hispanic. But about 17% is Hispanic. So that's the largest majority minority. And then 6% being Asian. And again, these are wide sweeping groups, right? Because there's all little subgroups in all this. But when we look at disparities that can kind of fall, and specifically about health, okay? So looking at different areas, we have disparities in actual prevalence of disease. So if we look at Blacks versus whites, because a lot of research has gone into this, we have seen that heart disease mortality is 40% higher in the Black population versus the white. Death rate from cancer is 30% higher in Blacks versus white. Then we have disparities in actual medical interventions. So this is when our providers start getting involved. Minorities are less likely to receive preventative vascular screenings and procedures. This also goes with other preventative screenings like mammograms for cancer. Whites actually receive certain preventative cardiac procedures 4 times more frequently than Black population, even though the Black population is 50% more likely to have a stroke than their white counterpart. So right there is when we need to start recognizing we play a role in this. Healthcare providers and future healthcare providers play a role in this. Then disparities in insurance status. I mean, insurance itself can't get care if we can't pay for it, right? Or if we completely bleed our savings to try to care for ourselves. And the largest uninsured population within the US is 31.5% of Hispanics are uninsured. And Blacks are twice as more likely as whites not to be insured. A lot of this insurance disparities are due to those socioeconomic issues that result in minority populations. And then we also have just disparities in health outcomes in general, okay? We see that infant mortality for the Black population is more than twice the rate of the white population. The incidence of amputation and mortality related to vascular diseases in minorities is significantly greater than whites. And these are only little snippets. The minority health, this is another link that I put in here, but I am going to share with you if you want to see these statistics, because I don't know about you, I like looking at statistics. I think they're fun. But this is getting some really good real-time information through the Minority Health, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Now, why do we have these disparities? Okay. There are some variables. There's many variables, and I'm going to just touch on the kind of main categories, because again, we're going to talk about in future presentations more details and the research behind this. So we have societal causes, right? Minorities tend, minority race and ethnic groups tend to fall in lower socioeconomic status, right? Healthcare is expensive, period. Educational attainment, again, due to environmental barriers, socioeconomic status, the actual racism within the system as a whole, we see that there is not as much access to that healthcare. And the existence, what's kind of feeds on itself and almost sometimes feels like a helpless situation, is the existence of health disparities has a negative effect on society, correct? Because people become sicker, sick society. They don't get the care they need. Too much money going where it shouldn't, where it needs to go. Yet, how society is structured and the ideology of it stimulates health disparities, just feeds on itself over and over and over again. Then we have the individual level. This is where, when we look at healthcare, we have seen things that individuals of different races and minority races, they don't have trust in their providers or in the healthcare system. They also have worse health outcomes, a lot due to how our society treats them. Microaggressions, higher levels of cortisol and stress on a daily basis. We see a lot not with the cultural misalignment. Okay, going back to working in a healthcare system that might be culturally blind, might be blaming the patient. And then the provider relationship, and this is where we really need to be mindful as practitioners, is that one, we would hope that nobody that is committed their life to helping others in a medical profession would discriminate. But it happens. It happens. And then sometimes there's kind of just things that happen out of ignorance, like not providing sensitive communication, not having appropriate translators, not having maybe your home exercise program available to somebody who maybe has low health literacy. Now, all of these legally you are supposed to have, according to stemming from the Civil Rights, 1964, and the class standards. You are legally bound to provide these services, but it doesn't happen all the time. And it's also been proven that in sometimes daily interactions, providers are providing less health education to minorities. Probably a lot of it has to do with not feeling as comfortable, not knowing how to approach that conversation. And in addition to that provider relationship, there's research that's really fascinating that has to do with concordance, patient-provider concordance, and outcomes with minorities because the provider is of the same cultural group. But that's hard because we also have an issue of trying to recruit into education minorities. So again, it's kind of downstream, upstream issue. So we're understanding ourselves. Where do I need to improve? We're understanding the world. Okay, whoa, that's more than I realize out there. I was not aware of those statistics. I was not aware that that existed. That's okay. Good, good. Now you know, right? Now we're aware. So now we need to approach and find resources. And I've provided two here that I think are just really, really important. Georgetown University has an entire website dealing with cultural competence. Now, they used to also had an absolutely wonderful self-assessment that you could do online for free. I used to make my students do it, actually, but it has been under construction for a good 5 years now. I check back every couple of terms. It's still under construction, but the resources on it are excellent. So I'm going to just pop that in there for you all to check out if you'd like to, or just flag. Because their mission, this National Center for Cultural Competence, is to increase the capacity of healthcare and mental health care programs. So this is specific to healthcare programs. Because cultural competence can be across the board in various different parts of industry, but we really want to focus on what we can give you for health. And then the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So I shared with you their link that has to do with minority health, but this is a link that actually takes you directly to needed or resources that you might want to look at for training in cultural competence. And whether you want to use these yourself or even in your future career, bring them to the attention maybe of an organization that you're a part of, this is a great place to start. All right. So these are my takeaway tips. My takeaway tips here. One, and I've kind of grouped them accordingly, so I'm going to say them. Growth is not always comfortable, all right? I'm going to include, we have to be uncomfortable to get motivated to move and change, all right? So the charge is get out of the Barcalounger of life. Get out of your comfort zone. If it feels uncomfortable while you're doing these self-assessments, maybe while you're having a conversation, that's actually a good thing. Because it basically means you are starting to you're getting entrenched in where you need to be. You need to have that uncomfortable conversation. You need to be challenged. You need to be questioned. And it's a skill to learn how to cultivate that and not get defensive. These next three, I linked these together, all right? Because these next three, I think the linchpin to be willing to self-reflect, be willing to listen, be willing to learn, is humbling yourself. And that's hard, especially when you're an educated individual or you're going through a lot of education. You know, you get to a certain part, well, I don't know what I'm talking about, right? Don't need to tell me, right? But you have to take yourself to a humble place to recognize and admit when we are wrong, where we could do better. And that's going to lead us to actively pursuing knowledge to better ourselves. Now, I never knew that. Oh gosh, I never thought of that. I had no idea that was offensive. Oh, I just said that phrase. Oh my gosh, we've been saying that forever and I had no idea. But if somebody's telling you it's offensive, listen. And then the last two, be willing to change, be willing to act. These, I think, are the most courageous. They're also the most impactful. And because when you change, get out of the Barcalounger of life, okay? When you act, you become the pebble in the pond. You're the pebble in the pond. And those ripples that you create from being the pebble in the pond because you acted, you were willing to change, those become waves. Waves to move an entire ocean. And if you just think of how many little pebbles, if they were dropping in a pond, how many ripples could be made? And think, those ripples, they're going to intersect and they're going to bump up and they're going to clash and you're going to have a storm. But nothing is better than after a storm when the calm comes. So I just really, really, really encourage everybody to be open to those uncomfortable conversations, be open to self-reflection. And hopefully, as we continue with these future presentations, Dr. Boykin, I know, is going next, and she's going to be shedding some more facts and light on, I think, the research out there specific to disparities. We can all learn something. I know I learn something every day. And thank you. I appreciate you all coming. And if anybody had any questions, I noticed some people put some really great statements, or if anything that you would like to address or discuss, I would be open to that. Or Dr. Boykin, would you like to open the floor?
Yes, I would. Thank you so much, Dr. Kiernan. That was absolutely awesome. As you see in the chat, all the thank yous and that was awesome. If anybody has any questions, if you would go ahead and unmute yourself and ask the question, or if you feel uncomfortable asking, unmute it, you can type it in the chat.
So when talking about the continuum, I noticed that you said, like, if you're like figuring out where your organization's at with it. So is that something like when we're searching for jobs that like we can address in an interview, like where they stand? And if so, how do we do that tactfully?
That's a great question, Miley. And actually, I know we have probably some people in the audience that could probably also contribute to this, that are clinicians themselves, or even just people in the work environment. But I know a good place to start is pretty much every organization usually has a vision statement. They have a mission statement. They have strategic goals. And I know I do this a lot of the times when I am speaking with another organization and I want to get to know them. I go to those mission and goals and I look at how they're worded. I look to see if there is a desire of stewardship, of diversity, of inclusion. Because then that also gives me an idea of maybe how I can phrase a question. But I also know that, that's it's a sensitive topic, right? But I think that's a good place to start. Does anybody have any advice? I think Dr. Petroselli, do you want to elaborate on your comment?
I would just like to say, I'm new to Florida, but when I worked in New Jersey, when I was looking for jobs, I tended to be drawn to job descriptions that talked about things like culturally rich environment, or even a lot of times you'll see like the rote OT job description, but some of them will say able to address clients in their variety of cultural needs. And I really will sometimes expand on that in my interview. And that will give me a good feeling of like, did they just put that in the job description because they think they're supposed to, or because they actually value that as a department, as a facility?
I don't know if anybody else has any tips, especially those in the workplace, for our students who might be listening. It's a very emotionally charged arena right now. There is no denying that. It's emotionally charged. It's dividing along political lines. I'm not gonna lie, it's getting ugly out there, right? It's getting ugly out there. But again, going back to what I was saying, change isn't comfortable and change isn't always pretty. So the fact that you even want like Marlene, what you suggested, that you want to know those things, you want to open that conversation. I would just hope that we see more of that in the upcoming workforce, because I think even what employees will start to see is, wow, this seems to be important to our future generation, our future workforce, because they're asking about it, they're demanding to be educated, and that's going to again drive change in some manner.
So Miley, I wanted to, it's a great question and comment, and like I always look at the mission statement. I look at the makeup of the staff. I don't want to just interview with the boss. I want to interview with all the faculty or all the staff that I'm going to go work with in a hospital, because I want to see what the makeup of those people are, because they're my side-by-side coworkers, right? So it's not just reading their mission statement, but that's part of it. And when you were mentioning that, Miley, I was thinking, in my free time, whenever I go somewhere, or I visit churches, and I'm always interested in seeing what their mission statement is. And the cynic in me always wants to say yes, but do they walk the walk? So I always would ask, so like, what service projects are you doing? Or, so you kind of want to ask not completely poignant questions, but ask those questions about, in what ways are the staff here involved in their community? And that might tell you something about the values, maybe not of the organization, but certainly of the individuals who work there. Mm-hmm. And generally, we are a reflection of our organization in some capacity, right? So, and if we're not, we move on. But organizations also change and grow too. And I think Deus's point about just, like right now, it's the in buzzword to use diversity. So we're not clear about like, how is it, really practice in this organization. So I would ask for examples. I'll be quiet.
No, Dr. Shotwell, I think that's great. And I think Dr. Surratt made a really good comment there, that, and fully acknowledging that it's not always the case, right? It can't always occur. But sometimes, you can kind of test the waters, right? You can test the waters in one capacity before you really invest fully, doing PRN work before really coming on full time. So the fact that you're just thinking about it, I think is important. And I would hope, you start to be more, I think people be more mindful about their choices is a wave of the future, I hope. Sticking with that ocean kind of analogy. Does anybody have any other questions?
I wanted to make a statement. I attended, just as far as being like a new grad, soon to be, I'm going to be in my third term of PT school in California. So I did attend a session. It was LGBT related. So we're talking about cultural competency and like inclusive. I can't even say it. Inclusive.
I have problems with
yeah. So one of the things I had mentioned was like, it's not just for not just for like the patients to be aware about, but like for like anybody who's wanting to go into like some sort of clinic or type of medical setting, is just like pay attention to the little details if you do plan on visiting a clinic. One of the things somebody mentioned, like if sometimes you'll see, and it's not just medical clinics, you'll see like a sticker like in front of clinic, like a rainbow symbol, and that can give you an idea too in that aspect of cultural competency and whatnot, that clinic has values that are very inclusive and accepting of people of all walks of life. So I guess that's something like a little tidbit
Yeah,
when
I think
applying.
that's great. I think that's a great I mean, we do it unconsciously. I mean, we look at bumper stickers, right? We look at signs people put in their yards. We look at the flags that they hang out. And all of that is giving us kind of cueing of knowing how we're going to probably adjust our behavior when we interact maybe with, someone that is displaying that symbol. And that, again, that's kind of a material, that's the part of that, like a tangible material culture. And I identify with this culture. So I think that's really an important tip, that paying attention back towards not just behaviors, but the tangible and intangible parts of culture. If there was one last question that anyone would like, or even if you just had something to share.
This is Thais again. Sorry, I feel like I'm bogarting this, but
Nope.
this is like one of my favorite topics to talk about. And I could go on and on because I feel like I'm constantly learning, and I think I want to drive that point home. Like, you're always learning, and I'm always open to learning, and being humble and being open to learning is important. But I like what you said about like one drop can turn into a wave. And I sadly remember starting at an acute care hospital at the same time as a colleague who was Spanish speaking. She's originally from Colombia, and like literally they were just not translating anything for anyone, even though it was the law. I mean, this was 2008.
Mm-hmm.
So she was like mad, and we were all, and everyone would kind of realize why she was mad. And she was like, you know what, I'm going to start translating all the home exercise programs. And she did. And she said, and then she's like, I'm going to start using the language line. And then people started just seeing that tiny modeling behavior. So she made a big initial, this is ridiculous, people kind of plea, but then she started changing her actions, and people followed her modeling. So yes, we should yell and present it and bring it up forward, but also modeling behavior. People do pick up on modeling behavior.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, I was following her model, and then that became my gold standard to then show my students. So then I'm hoping those students someday could go out at other hospitals and model it as well. So, sometimes if you don't feel like you have the platform to get out here and really speak, sometimes modeling the behavior will also help.
Yeah, I think that is such a great point to like close it out. I love that, because not everybody has to feel like they're shouting from the rooftops for change, or out in the streets, or trying to affect policy, because that might not be where they feel the most effective. But if they feel like, you know what, I can model appropriate behavior, I can make a point of conducting myself and saying and doing what I feel is culturally sensitive, that it's again the little pebble and the little rock. And change occurs over time, but any amount is important. And I do want to stress, it's hard because it is so emotional, and we have very visceral emotional responses, as we should as humans. That to deny that would just be, we would be robots, and that is not who we are. We feel very passionately about things, but we also have to keep in mind that an interaction with someone that might not be on the same page, the only way that potentially that can really be turned into a teaching moment or a translation of knowledge is that we approach in a way of empathy and a way of giving the other party grace, of trying to understand where they come from, even if it is just bending your mind. I can't understand this, because there is the potential of shutting down what could be potential growth. And we don't want to do that. We don't want people to isolate and shut down. And healthcare providers, let's face it, you all are going to be, especially when we look at the healthcare professionals that are probably within this talk, we spend a lot of time with our patients. We create a sense of trust and rapport that is beyond a lot of what is spent in the healthcare profession in general. And we just have I think we have the potential to make some of the greatest impact with individuals because of how much time we spend with them and how much trust we cultivate in that relationship. So that's my little plug for the healthcare providers that are here at the university.
What a great way to end our talk. Thank you so much, Dr. Kiernan, and thank you to everyone that came out tonight to start this series. It was extremely beneficial and a great way to start. Hope everyone enjoyed the presentation. Have a great evening.
Thank you, everyone.